Okay, shalom everyone. Good morning, good evening. And I think some friends are coming in from Malaysia. It's about 10 o'clock their time. I'm very, very happy to have Professor Katz back with us again. The last time he spoke was in July 2022. And it seems like eons ago, but I'm very grateful for you taking the time, Professor, to come and speak about the identity and color among the Jews of India, excuse me, and as well as our friends from India, from Israel, from US, and Zilka Joseph, I think you are from India as well, and Natasha is from India. Shalom to you all. Thank you so much. First of all, let me introduce Professor Katz. I think he doesn't need much introduction, but for those who are new to this platform, let me introduce him here. Professor Katz is a distinguished professor emeritus at the Florida International University and a seminal figure in the field of Indo-Judaic studies. Excuse me, I'm having a bad cold. With his wife, Ellen Goldberg. He has authored pivotal books and scholarly articles about the Jews of India and is the founding editor of the Journal of the Indo-Judaic Studies and has been deeply engaged in Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain interreligious dialogues. Professor Katz in the academic world has written 15 books and more than 100 academic articles. He has won numerous awards, including the Fulbright Grant, and was a finalist for the 2000 Jewish National Book Award. He's also the founding chair of FIU's Department of Religious Studies, the Bhagwan Mahavir Professor of Jain Studies, the Kaufman Professor of Global Entrepreneurship in the College of Business and Administration, and affiliated faculty in the College of Medicine, Director of Jewish Studies, and the founder and Director Emeritus of the Innovative Program in the Study of Spirituality. Professor Katz has written books, which includes a memoir, Spiritual Journey Home, Eastern Mysticism to the Western Wall in 2009, Who Are the Jews of India in the year 2000, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. The Last Jews of Cochin, Jewish Identity in Hindu India with his wife, Ellen Goldberg, Ethnic Conflict in Buddhist Societies, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Burma, also with his wife, Ellen Goldberg. He has studied, taught, researched, and lived in South Asia for more than 8 years, and together with his wife, led study tours throughout India and Sri Lanka. So this is who Professor Katz is. So I would not say much. Let us jump in. And Professor Katz, I leave it to you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure having you again.
Well, Rivka, I see some friendly names there. Welcome to the people I know and the people I don't know. Rivka, especially to you for inviting me for a second time. It's very much an honor to me to be able to speak with you. And today we're going to talk about a very, frankly, very difficult issue. It's an issue I would prefer never to talk about, but we must because it's important. And we're dealing with issues of race, color, caste, and all these unpleasant topics as they apply to the Jews of India. This is, I think, the most recent talk I've developed, and it was requested in academic circles. These questions about race and identity and color and all these things are dominating academic inquiry these days. And when I had done my work, it was addressed, but now it has to be addressed again in a clearer way. Unfortunately, it's not a clear topic, as you will see, but let's give it a try. So you know I'm sure that in academic world, what is called critical race theory is one of the dominant intellectual, if I want to be polite, I'll say trends. If I want to tell you how I really feel, I will say intellectual fads, because I think that's what it is. But it's important. Nevertheless, it's important, and universities are obsessed with it. So let me talk about it. You also probably know that in the United States, especially in Silicon Valley, the computer AI center of America, there's a tremendous struggle going on now, of all things, about caste. And Indian people from lower strata are complaining in the United States that Indians from higher strata are discriminating against them. That is, like, the conflict that goes on in India has somehow been transported lock, stock, and barrel to California. So what is caste? What is race? And how essential is that to India in particular? And I'm going to be arguing today that it's not particularly so, and that, well, let me just get and show you what I'm going to do instead of talking about what I'm going to do. So I'm going to open up the PowerPoint now. I think that's it. There it is. Okay. So that's me. Most of the photos in this PowerPoint are by Ellen Goldberg. She is my co-researcher in all things, thoroughly. And that's one of the books. So we're talking about color and Indian Jewish identity. And I'm going to go in depth about one particular example of this that took place in Cochin. And I will look at similar questions among not only the Cochin Jews, but the Bnei Israel or Bnei Israel, the Baghdadis and their relationship with the Bnei Israel and other Jews in several cities in India and Burma. So the scandal by which Cochin Jews are known, sadly, is this business that has been called Jewish apartheid. And in the 1950s, a South African rabbi, Louis Rabinowitz, came, visited Cochin and talked to people and wrote actually a rather good article where he described the relations between the different groups of Jews in Cochin as apartheid. We'll look at that. And fortunately, that story does have a resolution when the gentleman on the right side of the screen, Avraham Barak Salem, who is very well known, led a movement to regularize, normalize relations between two groups of Jews in Cochin, and it was ultimately successful. We got an inside look at this because when my wife and I lived in Kochi in the mid-1980s, we stayed in the home of AB's son, who's on the left there, Raymond Salem. And he told us many stories of his father, and we discussed with him at great length this whole story of Jewish apartheid and how it affected him. Raymond is not one of the, he's part of the Paradesi or the foreigners community, but he's in a mid-range group of Jews who lived in Kochi called the Shukrarim, but we'll get to that. Let's go. So we know the word caste, and if anyone in the Western world takes a course in India, they will learn about caste. They will learn about caste extensively with, I would argue, an overemphasis. The cliche is that in the intro to India class at American University, it's all about cows, caste, and curry as a kind of superficial notion of what India is, unfortunately. So the word caste is not an Indian word, as you may know. It's become one. It first is introduced into India in the year 1502. And in Indian chronology, that's yesterday, that's recent. And at that time in 1502, the Portuguese explorer whom we may know, Vasco da Gama, landed in Kochi. And you can see on the right side of the picture, it's called the St. Francis Church, but it's built by da Gama himself. It's the first Roman Catholic church in India. And da Gama saw a stratified society, and he called this casta, which in Portuguese means what we would say in English, class, an economic designation only. Right? That's all it was. So da Gama observes what is not hard to observe, that the society he's seeing is a class society. Most are to some degree or another. Even our so-called totally egalitarian America also has classes that are problematic for us. All right. So point one, the word caste is introduced to India in 1502, fairly recently, to describe a class system. Now, through time, this idea of caste or class gets introjected or accepted in India itself as a reasonable description of their society. So the caste system, so-called, in many senses, is an overlay onto Indian society by a European. That's not to say that India didn't have classes and all these things, but it is to say the whole idea that we learned, say, from anthropologist Louis Dumas, who wrote the best book about caste, that has to do with hereditary occupations, fine, intermarriage taboos, fine, interdining taboos, fine, and a whole scale from impurity to purity, with the purest at the top, the most impure at the bottom. That was, and maybe continues to be, the most influential book about caste ever written. His name is Louis, to pronounce it in English, Dumont, D-U-M-O-N-T, Louis Dumont, is written in French. It's published in English. That's the idea of caste. It is not, I'll say it again, an Indian idea. Neither is color. So in 1686, a group of Jews this time from Amsterdam visited Kochi. And the descriptions of the visit are marvelous. They can be read. They were absolutely amazed by what they found in Kochi, such hospitable, pious, learned Jews. This is the beginning of Europe's awareness of Jews in Kochi. This group from Amsterdam, of Amsterdam Jews. Now, I have to say a little bit about Amsterdam Jewry in the 17th century. They had just arrived from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, where they were oppressed, as you know, terribly. When they came to Amsterdam, they found they were free to pursue their religion, and they built a beautiful synagogue in Amsterdam, and in commerce, and they became important traders and played an active role in the prosperous economy of Amsterdam. So these were Portuguese and Spanish Jews who migrated to Amsterdam after the expulsion. And these Jews, who were very interesting, they were very enthusiastic Jews, very enthusiastic, because they had recently in memory become free to practice Judaism after they'd been oppressed. And to them, that was a world-shaking event. And to them, very often it meant that the Mashiach, the Messiah, must be coming anytime, that we Jews are free now, we can do things, and so on and so on. So in this enthusiasm that was fueled by a kind of messianic coming of Mashiach, passion led the Jews to find lost or remote or Jews that they didn't know about. And they went, and of course they'd heard about Cochin, largely because, and I'm sure you know this, Cochin was a spice trading center, and Jews were prominent in the spice trade, and the spice trade had been going on between India and Europe since the Roman Empire. It's a very old business and a very long established trading patterns between Europe and India. So they had heard Jews were there. Now they have access to these Jews. So Moses Pereira de Paiva, a member of the community, set sail for Kochi, and he landed in 1686, and he was the first record we have of European Jews visiting Kochi. There undoubtedly were before, but we have no record. And he said he made a list of all the Jewish families in Kochi, and after each name, he wrote after them a description, blanco or negro, white or black. Black's not black and white's not all that white. But these, you have to understand, these are primary categories in European civilization. This hyper race consciousness is European. It is not particularly Indian, and not even well, it's not Indian anyway. So Europeans come there and start to talk about people as white or black based on pigment of skin. That's important, because when it gets later, where black and white are used in indigenous Indian discussions about one another, but it's nothing to do with skin color in those days. For Europe, it was skin color. So two ideas get introduced, one in 1502, caste, and one in 1686, color. And once these ideas are introduced into India due to the colonial power and manipulation of Indian society, these became accepted in India. And indeed, Indians themselves use these terms to understand themselves. You get it? They're foreign terms. They don't really describe the reality. But since the powerful people come and use these words to talk about the reality there, it becomes accepted by Indian people. Caste and color. Now, what was that? Now it gets complicated, I'm sorry to say. What was de Paiva talking about then? What was going on in Cochin if it wasn't exactly color and caste? Color and caste are foreign notions that don't really describe anything in India. So to try to get a sense of this, we go back to 1520, early 16th century. Remember, de Paiva arrives 1502. De Gama arrives in 1502. De Paiva comes 100 years later or so. So this letter happened around that time, but it didn't involve Europe. It involves Egypt and India. And those of you who are Jewish may well know, if I have a question about how behavior, what can I eat, what can I do, so I go to my rabbi and I ask, and he gives advice, and if I should take it, sometimes I do. But when you don't have a rabbi or you have a question that's so complicated that your local rabbi can't handle it, you write a letter. You write your question, called shaila, it just means question, and you send that to a rabbi in another place for whom you have great respect, reputation. That is, in Jewish world, we all try to follow, some of us do, the Jewish law, but there are different streams of Jewish law, and it's always been interpreted in many different ways. So in my tradition of Judaism, I would go to certain rabbis to ask questions. And if you're a Sephardic Jew, or if you're this Jew, you would go to another rabbi. And in the early 16th century, the most eminent Sephardic authority on halakha, on Jewish law, was a man named Rabbi David ben Solomon Ibn Zimra, as he's known. He's done very many important things. Incidentally, he's the one who first identified the Ethiopian Jews as Jews. And since in the 16th century, there's a rabbinic tradition that the Ethiopian Jews are really Jews, they were never questioned in the 20th century or 21st century. We can go into that in more detail later. So if I write a shaila, a question, and I send it to a rabbi, this case in Alexandria, Egypt, the rabbi will write back and with a response, question, response. Response means teshuva, right? So shaila, question, teshuva, response, question and answer. And there's a tremendous body of literature, Jewish legal literature, that is composed of shailot and teshuvot, questions and answers, because they're nicely written down. When you write a shaila, you state your question. Then when you answer the shaila, you restate the question and then give your answer. So in cases where we only had the shuva, as in this case, we understand what the shaila was because it's restated in the shuva. I hope that's just, I know it's a lot of new words for you all, but I hope I'm being real clear. All right, so this shaila arrives around 1520, a little bit earlier. And it's from Kochi. We don't know who wrote it, but the letter describes that in the early 16th century, this is after the Jews had, or started, the Jews from Europe, from Portugal, from Spain, had been arriving, we know, around that time. The letter describes that there are 900 families, Jewish families in Cochin at this time. And 100 of them, he says, are meyuchasim. Terribly long, difficult word. And so the other group is called the Mishuchrarim, another long, terrible word. So this is why it gets complicated. Meyuchas is one who has what we call, you can read it, yichus, which means I can show you by descent through generations. That's called yichus. Those of you who may be Hindu who are listening, to find out your gotra, you go up to Haridwar or somewhere and you look at the record, you see your descent. And that gotra is sort of like what we mean by yichus. It's my descent. So the meyuchasim, those with attestable lineage to Jerusalem, to Israel. That's one group. So they say, we're Jews because we have yichus. Saying we have yichus means we can tell you who our ancestors were. And as you'll see, those ancestors were in Jerusalem. That secondary becomes important. The other group are called the Meshuchrarim. And a Meshuchrarim is one who has a shichrur, which is a legal document that makes one a Jew. Right? A shichrur means this person may have been a slave, may have been this, may have been that. But when they have this document, it shows that they're 100%, they've gone through the process, and it shows that they are 100% Jews according to Jewish law. In fact, those laws are so strict, if someone has a shichrur or another document of conversion, we may not even mention to them or to anyone, you don't say anything, this person's a convert, this person has yichus. These ideas are forbidden in Jewish law. You cannot remind, you never embarrass anyone. We're very big on that. And embarrass someone is like murder, they say. It kills the reputation, it kills part of the soul. So you never embarrass and say he's a convert, he's this, we don't do that. But they did it here. So the letter, the shaila says, they, meaning the Meshuchrarim, the Meyuchasim, the ones with Yuchas, the minority, will not marry them, the larger group, calling them slaves, meaning descendants of slaves. They refuse to intermarry with their co-religious, despite the fact that this larger group of Jews are rich, devout, and charitable. And they're well positioned in the local society of Kochi at the time. They were intimate with royalty in trading and in military. They're very good soldiers, shipbuilders. Because of their skills and abilities, they were close to the Maharajas of the time, but they lacked they couldn't produce this shechrur. They didn't have the document, though everyone said they had a document. So the meshichrarim, those with a document, after tabila means immersion in water, dunking in water, and that's an essential part of the process of conversion. A conversion is completed with the dunking in a pool of water witnessed by rabbis. That's called tabila. So once one has had tabila, then one is a Jew and one is marriageable. See, yet the Meyuchasim said, we don't marry with them. Right? And the letter back to Shiloh says, you have to. They're good Jews. There's no reason not to marry them. If indeed they were slaves and had a shikhr, it doesn't matter. Whatever they came from, they're Jews. You have to treat them as Jews fully. Well, these haughty Jews, the ones with yichus, didn't like that. So they waited 20 years. And they wrote a letter to Rabbi Ibn Zimra's successor, Rabbi Yaakov de Castro in Alexandria. And they asked again. They asked the same question because they wanted a different answer. They wanted their prejudices reaffirmed, and they weren't reaffirmed. So de Castro basically wrote back with the same thing that Ibn Zimra. And in fact, there were similar petitions in 1882, and again, even in 1951, which is what led the South African rabbi to come to Kochi. So look at this, from what, 1520 to 1950. You get this going back and forth. I'm laughing. It's silly in a way, because once you get a rabbinic ruling, you're not supposed to go to another rabbi to get a ruling you like. I will confess that it's not so unusual. Okay, so you get this is the setup. Nothing about black and white, nothing about caste, high caste, low caste. This division in the community was 100% division in Jewish terms, in Jewish legal terms. Do you have a testable descent, yichus? If not, do you have a shikhr, a document that replaced that as good as yichus? And the problem is the local Jews didn't think it was as good, but Jewish law says it is. All right. So what does that mean? The question involves miyuchasim and meshuchrarim, but in India, something that we can, I don't know what to call it, we called it substance, becomes more important than tradition. Substance, I'll say what that is in a moment, is more important than Jewish law, which is, you shouldn't say it, shouldn't. So substance became the rule in Kochi. It's true. Substance involves both the mother's blood, which is traditionally Jewish. If you don't know, Jewish status depends, in the most common sense, on birth from a Jewish mother. And it's transmitted, Jewishness is transmitted from the matrilineal line. So if someone says they're Jewish, it's my mother and her mother and her mother and her mother that was Jewish. That's what makes you Jewish. So, and that's the only concern in Jewish law. But somehow the blood, the red, and somehow in India, among the Cochin Jews, the father's fluid, semen, white, became equal in importance with the blood. Blood and semen became equally important, to put it in a, what kind of way? Accurate way. And the charge that they had tainted blood. They didn't have pure blood. And what they came to claim is they, the Miyuchasim, had blood from Jerusalem, meaning Israel in general, and blood from Kranganur. Now, what is Kranganur? Kranganur is a place where the Jews first landed in India. According to their traditions. You can see a painting that shows what Kranganur might have looked like back when. Kranganore was the capital, the most important city in this region. It was a trading center. In fact, the Romans built a temple, I think it was to Zeus, not Zeus, Jupiter. Anyway, one of their gods. In this place, they called the place Muziris, Muziris. It was their name for Kranganore. And the Jews called it Shingli, Shingly. Shingli is the Jewish name. Muziris is the Latin name. Kranganore is the Indian name, but that's the same place. And the Me'achasim says, we have blood from Jerusalem and from Kranganore, which is very interesting because Kranganore has no status in Jewish law, but it's important in India. That is, they're saying, when we came to Kranganore, we were welcomed by the king. We lived well. We were like royalty, et cetera, in Kranganore. And then we came to Kochi. But that I descend from Kranganore becomes a parallel line to we descend from Jerusalem. So to have both the red and the white substance, if you will, the blood and the semen, the Jewish and the Indian, however you put it, they claim we got both of these. And these other Jews, these Me'achasim, don't. So they would not marry them. They would not eat with them. So this is the halachic, the Jewish law issue. Then if you throw in a third factor, which is skin color, which is a European, not a Jewish or an Indian issue. Get that? It's not Jewish, it's not Indian, it's European. But that became in the mix of who is really a Yichus Jew, and it would be all three: blood, semen, and skin color. So during the colonial era, and this is only during the colonial era, Jewish identity was defined by A, Jewish law, B, these mixed ideas of substance, which come from whatever, perhaps Indian traditions, and ideas of color, which come from Europe. And the three together became the bulwarks of Jewish identity. All right, so let's go more with this. Let's go to 16th century, which is, when Ibn Zimmer wrote his letter. We have a group of newly arrived Jews who became known as Paradesi. Indians will know Paradesh, different country, foreigner. And they had, and also became called white. They had yichus, double yichus, if you will. They had great Jewish knowledge. They were very well learned, which is a kind of, in Jewish society, the status has probably more to do with your degree of Jewish knowledge than it has with your money or your position in society. It's knowledge, but they had it. More practically, they knew European languages, and they knew European currencies. They knew how to do business in Europe. This made them extremely valuable to the local Maharajas. For business, they had the recent connection to Europe. They could use those connections with their cousins who lived wherever they lived, in Alexandria, in Amsterdam, wherever they were. They had all these connections that they could exploit for the benefit of commerce, right? Now, it's sort of interesting that in this part of India, both Christians and Muslims have a similar notion of a foreign origin having particular yichus or value. And I mentioned that the Jews had the Paradesi synagogue, which was for the so-called white Jews. And then you had a bunch of synagogues for what became known as the Black Jews in Ernakulam and other cities. And then you had another group who had no synagogues, who were called Meshucharim, or brown Jews, for lack of a better term. So what was black and white, we became three categories. I'll explain it. Now, De Paiva notes the separation, and he said the two groups, they don't count for each other's prayer quora. They won't eat meat that is slaughtered by the other group's ritual slaughterer. And when we lived there, we saw that was long gone, that indeed, anyway. And there was no intermarriage between them. That also changed. The local group, whom scholars call Malabari, so there's a Paradesi Malabari you can use, white, black, I wish you wouldn't use, newly arrived Jews and long-standing Jews. You get to two groups. And the Malabaris had rival claims, and they also said we're from Jerusalem. So on the right, what you have there is a photo of engraved copper plates. They're very, very famous in Kerala, that the kings, and they're very smart kings you had there, would support, would help the various religious groups in his kingdom. So in this case, the king granted to the Jews, whom he called by the name Anshuvanam, doesn't matter, to the Jews, he gave them a kind of sovereignty, certainly autonomy. They could tax people going on their roads. They could do all these things that are symbols of, that are autonomy. They could also use symbolic symbols of status. They could carry a parasol, you know, and in India, of course, having a parasol is great status. You'll see that when a great Swami or the Dalai Lama's there, everybody's going around carrying umbrellas over him. That is to show honor to the king, to the Lama, to whomever it is. Jews had that right. In the same way, in some places, in liberal places in Europe, Jews were allowed to ride donkeys, but in other places they weren't. That was a kind of status too. So they were given all this status. And all of this was written in these beautiful engraved plates. So as long as the sun and moon exist, writes the king, these rights will be the eternal property of Joseph Rabban, Yosef Rabban, the leader of the Jews at the time, and his descendants, as I say, as long as the sun and moon exist. All right. So these plates become, in recent times, have become a symbol of controversy. They're kept in the Ark, the cabinet where the Torah scrolls are kept, in the Cochin synagogue, the Paradesi synagogue. They're still there as far as I know. They were there a few years ago when I saw. And so they're the Paradesis, right? But the Malabaris also claim, no, they stole the plates from us and they got these rival claims of yichus and so forth in Jerusalem and Krangenor get symbolized in these plates that charter their autonomy. Then, to make it more complicated yet, by the early 20th century, we had four groups. We had the Paradesis, so-called white Jews. We had their freed slaves, who were called meshuchrarim, which means they're freed and they're converted. When according to Jewish law, when a slave, when an Eved Kamani, a non-Jewish slave, is offered their freedom, as they should be, if they don't accept the freedom, they're marked with a pitchfork through a hole in their ear, and they put an earring as a sign of servitude. Whereas if they say, no, I'd like to be Jewish, they're learned, they know everything, they're given the full conversion process, and then they are Jews, theoretically considered at the same as all other Jews, but not necessarily. So you get the Paradesis, the white Jews, they're freed slaves called meshuchrarim. Then you get the Malabaris, who became known as black Jews, the original community who lived 8 synagogues all around Cochin area. And the Malabaris also had their slaves, who were called, in the Malayalam word, Urumakam. So you have 4 groups. It just gets more and more complicated. And all of them had various disabilities, no intermarriage, no interdining. This picture here is of the fabled Kochi synagogue, or Paradesi synagogue, built in 1568. This was the synagogue of the so-called white Jews, the Paradesi Jews. If they allowed any of the Urmak or Malabari or Meshuchrar faction, any of the other groups in, they had to sit in the lowly seats and weren't given honors in the synagogue as most Jews would be. They get only menial roles. So they constantly faced discrimination with varying severity. So the Meshucharim, the brown Jews of Kochi, said were manumitted slaves, their descendants, who were often Yalidei Bayit, people, servants, who became converted in time. Then and they did not have any synagogue. They had diminished roles in the Paradesi synagogue. They could not be called up to chant certain prayers. They were not allowed to be buried in coffins, of all things. They couldn't marry the white women, and they had to sit on the floor. And all of these things are against Jewish law, but they did it anyway. Starting in 1840, which is a while ago, the discriminated against Jews, led by a fellow named Avo, led a rebellion. And he built his own synagogue and said, "The heck with you, we're going to go ahead anyway." But the white Jews went to the Diwan, the governor of the region, and he took the side of the white Jews. We're not sure why. We don't have documents, maybe because of just they were more profitable for him. So he told the Meshucharim, you got to stay in your role, stay in your place, as he put it. They should walk submissively to the white Jews. The resolution, now it's Jewish apartheid and the Jewish Gandhi. So now we go to Avraham Barak Salem. He is the gentleman on the right. You're in the photo there. And he is the grandson of Avo, who led the rebellion in the 1840s. He was born in 1882. He was the first university graduate from his faction. He became a lawyer, and he became a firebrand. He was in 1929. He went to the All India National Congress meeting in Lahore, and he met with Gandhiji and other leaders. And as it turns out, Gandhi, his biggest issue really, he spent more time on temple entry than he did on kicking the British out. He cared about both, don't get me wrong. But the idea for Gandhi that some Hindus couldn't go into certain Hindu temples was abhorrent to him. That was utterly against the spirit of Hinduism. So he spent a lot of time leading demonstrations and movements to allow for access to temples from low caste or untouchable, whatever groups. In a town called Vaikom, which is very near Kochi, in the state of Travancore, Gandhi was leading a march, a civil disobedience, satyagraha campaign to allow the lower status people into the temple in Travancore. Salem was there to see it, and he used the same tactics in Cochin about the synagogue. And he led groups of Meshucharim to do satyagraha on the steps of the synagogue in Kochi. And they began to have an effect over some decades. Finally, AB was granted a synagogue honor and so forth, a very important honor. And so now the so-called brown Jews are allowed to have honors in the Cochin synagogue. It was a while before they were allowed to marry the white group, so to speak. But they could be buried decently and so on and so on. The story ends, fortunately. Oh, this is AB when he went to Israel with the president of Israel, Yitzhak Ben Tzvi. And he's telling him informing him about the Cochin community. And you may have heard of the Ben Tzvi Institute in Jerusalem. It studies lesser known Jewish communities. I don't know what the right word is, like Cochin, wonderful library that I've used. So the president of Israel takes a great interest in the Cochin Jews. The great grandson of AB, who you see there, who is Raymond's brother, finally was allowed to marry in the synagogue. He married a so-called white woman. And that was it. By then, this is late, recently as 1978, the last barriers of this system were gone. So that's pretty much the story of the Cochin Jews. And to sum it up, the ideas of color and caste were introduced to India by Europeans. They are not indigenous. They are not adherent to India. They were adherent to Portugal, not so much Holland, but certainly to Britain. And I'll say more about how Britain exploited that when I talk about the Jews of Mumbai. However, when the colonial power introduces a concept, however alien it may be to the host culture, it is sometimes accepted and becomes part of the culture. Even though it comes from abroad, it becomes part of the culture in India of its day. And that's what we're dealing with when we talk about race and caste, largely. Just a quick word about the Bnei Israel, or the so-called the Bnei Israel, children of Israel. The British pronounce it Bnei Israel, which, okay, that's how they're largely known today. And Bnei Israel have two groups called Gora and Kala, white and black. Yet, I challenge anybody, if we see somebody who's Gora and somebody who's Kala, you would never see any difference. This has nothing whatsoever to do with color, even though the words are black and white. Color in the sense of skin pigment. Really, it all has to do with whether the same thing, the Yichus, whether they were Jews who came and landed in India from ancient Israel, or they were converted. So if they were converted, they were black. If they were foreign, they were white. Exactly the same language, the same words you find in masjids and in churches in Kerala. You have white and black Christians, white and black Muslims. They have separate mosques or churches from indigenous ones. This is just simply is not, I say that to let you know it's not uniquely a Jewish problem. I'll take a question now if somebody wants to ask, it's fine. No? Okay, I'll go on. Now, the Baghdadi community and the Bnei Israel community. You see a picture there of the oldest Bnei Israel synagogue in India. Now, I don't have time for little side stories. So the Baghdadi Jews arrived from Iraq, not from Baghdad, actually, from Basra, and they settled in Mumbai. So right away, you get this paradigm of the newly arrived Jews and the established Jewish community of Bnei Israel. You had this in New York, the German Jews, the Sephardic Jews were there first, then the German Jews, and much later, my people, the Eastern European Jews came. And when it's the same story, when the Sephardim were there and the Germans came, the Sephardi looked down upon the Germans. And when the German Jews were there and the Eastern European Jews, the German Jews, we don't want them here, there. So you get this kind of this bigotry is what it is. The longer you're there, the more you don't want other people to come there. Anyway, same thing in Mumbai. You have the Bnei Israel they were from the Konkan region outside of Mumbai. They were a modest community who were quote unquote discovered. That's a long story itself as the Bnei Israel. They had schools, they learned English, they realized the British were coming and building a city called Mumbai. They knew that if the British were coming there and building a city, this was the Wild West, the frontier, the place to make money, start business, get jobs. And they knew English, so many moved to Mumbai first. Then the Baghdadis came in the middle of the 19th century. So the newly arrived here have a higher status than the earlier community. The Baghdadis were higher status than the Bnei Israel, the opposite of what happened in New York. And the Baghdadis eventually became patrons of the Bnei Israel, but it wasn't such an easy process. This is a wonderful book called Jews in British India, Identity in a Colonial Era by Professor Joan Rowland, who analyzes the relations between the Baghdadis and the Bnei Israel in Mumbai. So The Baghdadis came to Mumbai, as we mentioned. They came to Kolkata. They came to Yangon or Rangoon. They set up communities. And in Calcutta, the Mumbai community, they came from Basra. They were called Baghdadis because they're from Iraq, though they weren't from Baghdad, they weren't only from Iraq. In fact, in Calcutta, they came from Syria, the city of Aleppo, the first community, and they were called Baghdadis. They were sort of Middle Eastern Jews who came during the British era, were called Baghdadis, whether they came from Aleppo or wherever else. You find subtle differences in the religious prayers and styles and tunes between the Mumbai Baghdadis and the Kolkata Baghdadis. The Kolkata Jews, the way they read Torah and some of the things they do, if you know, you can tell it's a Syrian tradition. And the Baghdadis, if you know, you can tell it's an Iraqi tradition. They're similar. And unless you really know, you would never tell. But there are these differences that the closer you are, the more distinct, more important. What to call them? One scholar called them Arabian Jews of India and the Far East, which I think is a much more descriptive, better term. Right? They were Arabic-speaking Jews, almost entirely, who came to India and set up communities in India, and they were a commercial business community, and they set up sub-communities in China and Japan and Singapore and all over Eastern Asia. They're also called the Jews of the Raj, which is not bad because they came when the Raj came and they left more or less when the Raj left. They were there when the British were there as a mercantile community. And we get what one scholar calls the phenomenon of transculturalization, that they were an international people. They lived in Mumbai or Kolkata, but they weren't of Mumbai and Calcutta, even though they were there for centuries. Their identity was always as Baghdadi Jews who lived in many places. They happened to be in Mumbai, but their sister-in-law came from Singapore, and somebody else was from Iraq, and somebody else was from Shanghai, and they were always in touch with each other. It's very interesting. In fact, in Calcutta, if anybody's from Calcutta, you'll know Nahum's Bakery is the only kosher Jewish bakery in India, well, nowadays, and they were the best baker. So you may have been in Kyoto in Japan, and you're getting married, you got to get the wedding cake shipped over from Calcutta. And the marriage matches were made from all these different countries, and as long as they're Baghdadi Jews, they are game for marriage. But they were not really an Indian community. They were a transcultural community that lived in India and other places. Now, what happens when a group moves into a new place? They often find other ethnic groups that resemble them, and they become what some scholars call reference groups. I know where I grew up in New Jersey, Jews were especially friendly with Italians. And we learned a lot how to be American from the Italians got there first, we came, and we made friends with the Italians, and they showed us how to do America, how to fit in, how to do this. And it said that in particular, if you're American, you might get it. The Italians taught the Jews how to have an American wedding. Our weddings were very formal and so on, and religious. The Italians, if you saw The Godfather, had great, big, fun weddings. So we took over their practice from them, just a little, and we could invite our friends, non-Jewish friends, and that made us fit into America. Well, in a similar way, in Mumbai, the Jews learned how to be Indian largely from the Parsis, the Zoroastrians in Mumbai. They were a very successful mercantile foreign community. They come from Iran. They were established. The Jews got there. They were similar foreign mercantile communities. So they became friends with the Parsis, and they helped them acculturate. Gateway to India, most famous monument in Mumbai, was built by the leading Parsi and the leading Jewish family together, and it's an Indian monument. That's Mumbai. In Calcutta, it was the Armenians. They moved first in the Armenian neighborhood. At first, they prayed. The Armenian church gave them a room, and they prayed in the Armenian church. Gradually, they got established and built their synagogues. But the Armenians were their bridge in Kolkata. But ultimately, the reference group was the British for all of them. So there were the Jews in Mumbai, in Kolkata, and so forth, trying to be British, identifying with the British. And this really became embedded in 1857, when what the British called the Mutiny of 1857, as if to downplay it. Indians call it the First War for Independence, which probably is more accurate. What happened, you probably know the history, but basically in 1857, members of the military who were Indian, serving in the British Army, because of course it was in British then, became more and more dissatisfied with their treatment in the military. The British, when they got there, it's amazing. What about the caste system that they used? They had a system that ranked every community in India in order. This is the real caste system, let me tell you. And the higher your group was in this ranking, the more you got. So if you joined the British Army, if you were from this group, you got so much pay and such good food. But if you're from a lower group, you got less pay and cheaper food. Only the highest groups were eligible for grants to be able to study in British universities. Whatever it was, the acceptance into medical school or universities in India, the seats were reserved for the higher groups, not for the lower groups. So everything the British did was based on where you fit in this ridiculous category of groups. That's caste to me. Now, so the more British you are, the more you seem to be British, the higher you were. So the Baghdadi Jews who had been speaking Arabic at home gradually came to speak English. Instead of wearing kaftans, they were tweeds. They became more and more identified with the British. Now, 1857, the Indians were revolting against the British, and everything Indian to the British eyes became suspect and dangerous. So you had this increasing chasm between British and Indians starts. Before that, the British thought the Indians really liked them and they got along well. That was their fantasy. But after 1857, the British knew how much they were resented and hated for conquering the country. So they began to distance themselves from Indian things and become more and more British. And that first meant distance themselves from their Indian cousins of Bene Israel. Tragic, but understandable. So the Baghdadis supported the British in 1857. The Bene Israel supported the Indians. You see how they're growing apart. The Bene Israel looked Indian to everybody, and they just felt Indian. They spoke Marathi. They spoke an Indian language as their native tongue. The Baghdadis spoke a little bit of Bengali or Hindi or Marathi, but they spoke Arabic and then English at home. So when push came to shove in the independence movement, the beginning of the independence movement in 1857, the British had the Baghdadis, the Indians had the Bene Israel. So how are the Baghdadis known? The word Baghdad wasn't so good. Because by the time you get to the 20th century, you had the First World War. Baghdad is part of the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire. Right? The Turks were the enemies of the British in World War I, as they were in World War II. So if you're Baghdadi, you're considered Ottoman or quote unquote Asiatic and not British. So you didn't want to be called Baghdadis, but they were already stuck with it. The Baghdadi Jews in China were a little bit smarter, and they said, no, we're not Baghdad, we're Sephardi, which they are, but Sephardi means Spain, it's Europe. You get it? So if you're Baghdadi, you're Asiatic. If you're Sephardi, you're Europe, in the way the British understood the world. but it's all a quest to be European. Yeah, racism had to do with it probably, but it was more practical matter. You want to go to school, you want to get a job, you want to get paid more. And that, unfortunately, was a big part. So anyway, you get the distancing between the Baghdadis and Beni Israel. So we mentioned after World War I, the British system overlays the indigenous hierarchy, benefits the British first, Europeans, Eurasians, the mercantile castes like the Parsis and the Baghdadi Jews, and then the native hierarchy, quote unquote. So the time, and the picture there is of the gorgeous Knesset Eliyahu synagogue in Mumbai, the beautiful place, and it's Baghdadi synagogue, the second one built by Baghdadis. And if you remember the picture of the Beni Israel synagogue that I started, much more modest. The Baghdadi synagogue is grandiose. That tells you a lot. So there are many Beni Israel in Mumbai. So for the Baghdadis, their rejection of Beni Israel and all things Indian was the most pronounced among all Jews in India. They excluded the Beni Israel community from everything. They claimed that their religion, the Baghdadis, was different from the religion of the Beni Israel. Crazy idea, but that's what they said. So one scholar says the British had the Anglo-Indians or Eurasians as their shadow self. They're connected, but they wanted to distance the connection. It's a shadow self. It's them, but it's not them. Can you get a sense of the ambiguity these people felt? So for the Baghdadis, it was the Beni Israel. Yeah, we're Jews, but we're not Jews. They're different. The difference. Same thing. British are to Anglo-Indians as Baghdadis are to Beni Israel. They were denied ritual honors in the synagogues. They wouldn't eat meat from the Beni Israel slaughters, did not count them for ritual quara. And what happened is a direct relationship emerged between the relative numbers of Baghdadis vis-a-vis Beni Israel. Interestingly, the fewer the Baghdadis, the greater their animus towards the Beni Israel. So, so that when they were outnumbered by the Beni Israel substantially, they treated them worse. We talked about this, the attitude towards nationalism. The Baghdadis were very, very charitable. If you go around Mumbai or Calcutta, hospitals, schools, everything, libraries built by Baghdadis, they did great charitable works for their cities, but not for the Beni Israel themselves. They were criticized repeatedly. The criticisms were ignored. This is another common theme, just as the Kochinim rejected the European rabbis and so on. So the Baghdadis reject the foreign rabbis. And as the cultural distance between the Baghdadis and the British intensified, so did the struggle between the Baghdadis and the Beni Israel. The more you British are distancing from us, the Baghdadis, the more we distance ourselves from the Beni Israel to show that we are one of you. It's a similar question in Yangon and Rangoon. I'm not going to go through. This is a beautiful synagogue in Rangoon today. They fought their things out in courses, in high courts. They took it to the Beit Din, and eventually the matter got resolved in Yangon largely through the courts, not through religious organizations. But it did go to the High Court in India, and they referred it to the Beit Din, the religious court in London, and the system got more or less. It wasn't as virulent in Rangoon. Finally, last one. I mentioned Nahum's Bakery. Right, this is Isaac Nahum, the grandson of the founder of the bakery. Lovely man. And I'm in Calcutta, we're sitting and talking with him about all these things. And this man's completely Indian. He's Jewish fully. He's Indian fully, but he loves all Jews. And so, frankly, there weren't enough numbers to continue this pattern of discrimination. at some point. But for whatever the reason, people's hearts finally changed. And I know in Mumbai, we often stayed with the family of the Afifs, Baghdadis, who had an apartment there. But there's always Beni Israel, especially younger people who came. And Ben Afif was like a teacher to the Beni Israel. And they had meals, they were extreme closeness. And the same thing in Calcutta nowadays. And Mr. Nahum said to us this way, all these Hindus, all these Indians, I know our Torah says we're supposed to dislike them because they're so quote unquote idolaters, whatever that is. But they're the most cultured, the finest people in the world. How can we feel that towards these people? In other words, after all this struggle and finding a home and creating a home and not liking another group, finally, the Indians, at least the Jews who remain in India, are at peace with being in India. And they're no longer British, they're no longer transnational, they're Indian, and they are now few. Anyway, I used up the full hour and then a little bit, Rivka, so I'll pass it back to you. Anything you care to discuss for as long as you like.
Thank you, Professor Katz. That was amazing. It was comprehensive, yet still a lot to take in. And I'm sure we have questions. You can stop your screen sharing.
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
There we are. Hi.
Okay, so coming back to the screen, I have a question here from Einstein Barreto. Einstein is a friend of mine, a colleague, and
great name.
Yeah, and a member of Herut, India. He says, Professor, I'm from Goa, India, and we have a sizable Jewish population in the 15th century. They moved to the Malabar region due to the cruel inquisition of the Portuguese. There was a Portuguese administrator, Horta Garcia, who was a Jew. He was persecuted when the Portuguese came to know he was Jewish. By the way, we have a garden called after him, Garcia de Horta.
Right.
Yeah.
Garcia de Horta was an amazing, amazing man. Someday I should put a whole show on about Garcia de Horta, but a genius in Goa and Mumbai. He was prominent. And he, anyway, yes, there is a Jewish history in Goa. I don't know of any Jews who remained there after the Portuguese sort of treated them so badly, but thank you for that.
Thank you, Einstein, for the question. Anyone else for questions or comments? Something interesting to say about the Jews of India?
You know, with this critical race theory being so much in the vogue in academics, it's very difficult because that theory holds that the relations between white people and all other people are, how should we say, permanently tortured, that there's something essential about the racism, that it can't be removed. But it has. I think they're wrong, that race played a part in India. But when you follow critical race theory, you believe that racism is always there. And what I'm trying to argue here is, no, it wasn't. It was introduced by the British. It had a history, it had a solution, and it's, at least the Jewish racism is gone now, finally, thank God. So this talk would not be terribly well received by people who believe very firmly in critical race theory. No doubt there are racial problems everywhere in the world, or there have been, but it's not a permanent condition to which we're condemned, I believe.
Rivka,
Yes, Herb.
Professor Katz, what was the impact on the Jews of India when Britain divided it in 1947?
Okay. There were Jewish communities in what is now Pakistan, there were several synagogues in Peshawar, which is up near the Khyber Pass, in Lahore, and in Karachi, and in Quetta also too, is Baluchistan in West Pakistan. So there were Jewish communities, but they were, when partition was made, most of the Hindus, as you know, in what became Pakistan went to India, and most of the Jews went with the Hindus. Some remained. But then in, was it 1956, was that little war between Israel and Egypt, the Suez campaign with France and Britain and Israel taking the Suez back from Egypt, if I remember. So there was a kind of conflict between Israel and an Arab country in 56, and that led to big disruptions and demonstrations and attacks on the synagogue in Karachi, which was the last one standing. So I occasionally, to this day, some people pop up here and there in Pakistan saying we're Jews, we've sort of been in hiding. And twice I was called by the Jewish agency to investigate these claims. Did I think they were valid or not? So it's extremely, there are a few individuals left there. There is no Jewish community there, but who knows? Who knows? If there's periodic talk about Pakistan and Israel establishing relations. And were that to happen, I think you might see a more emergence of Jewish identity, real or imagined, in Pakistan too. Right now, not much, but not none.
Thank you.
Okay, Mordecai, he says, Professor Katz is always a delight to learn from dispelling various myths about Jews and India. I thank him once again. And Brother Ovadia, thank you so much, Professor Katz. Mordecai says again, my great-grandmother was from Quetta, now Pakistan, from a Syrian Jewish family which dealt in rock salt and spice trade.
That's fascinating. Yes, I know you too.
Professor, I have a question. Were the Malabari Jews and the Bnei Israel and the Baghdadi Jews, were there any marriages among these communities among themselves?
No.
The north, south, east.
There may have been, I say no, there may have been, but for a Baghdadi to marry a Ben Israel means they were pretty much excluded from the community. It was like, if I may use the term that I said doesn't apply, an intercaste marriage, where you know what happens. So, and gradually the Cochin, they got over it, but I don't know of any Baghdadi Beni Israel marriages. I don't know of any.
Okay, thank you.
I was having a conversation just yesterday with somebody about race here and where I grew up and how it was. And it was really, I grew up in a very mixed neighborhood, Black people, white people, all kinds of people. And it never entered our minds until we became about 12 years old. And didn't enter our minds. That's what our then we were taught about race. Terribly. So it's when you get to these issues of marriage and sexuality and stuff that these, whatever is in our hearts, evil stuff in our hearts, it comes out in that. So, I mean, no country is free of it altogether either.
Natasha has a question. Were there conversions into the Baghdadi and Bnei Israeli communities?
A conversion is not into a community. A conversion is into Judaism. Does that make sense? So if I go through a conversion, I should be completely accepted by any Jewish community in the world. If I'm converted by an Ashkenazic rabbi in Miami, I can go to Cochin and I'm Jewish, and I can go to Israel. You know, it shouldn't matter at all. It shouldn't.
I have a comment here. When I was growing up, you know, we never spoke about caste and color at home. It was taboo in my home. But after I moved to India in 2005, and then I realized, oh my goodness.
And does everyone know you're from Sri Lanka? Because
No, my mom's from Sri Lanka, but I was born and
Yes.
brought up in Malaysia.
you were born where?
Malaysia.
I thought you were born in Sri Lanka. Oh, okay.
My mom's from Sri Lanka. Yeah. So but India is different, as you said, cow, caste, and chilies.
That's the stereotype.
Yeah.
I think.
Any questions, comments? Yes, Herb. Yes, Herb.
Comment, excuse me, speaking from the safety of Canada, which everybody probably considers is a nice, cool, clean, pleasant place. I can tell you of an incident where someone whom I worked with asked me why I killed Christ. And this particular individual at one point took his stapler and stuck a staple through my thumb.
Ooh.
So unfortunate. And how old were you?
20. That's 60
God.
years ago. 60 years ago.
It's one of those things. Anti-Semitism, it's rife. Okay, this is the last question or message. My mother's family, Benjamins, lived in Karachi for many years. I was born in Mumbai. We lived in Calcutta since my dad was transferred to Calcutta. When he was old, he did a lot of volunteer work for AJJDC. Through an agency in Mumbai, he also helped to bring funds to the disadvantage of poor Jews in Calcutta and small towns in Bengal. Thank you, Zilka, and bless your dad.
God bless you.
Thank you. I would like to wrap it up. One more question or comment before we wrap it up, please. Time for dinner in India.
I'm still having my morning coffee here.
I thank you, Rivka, for arranging this.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank
Thank
you,
you so much.
Rivka
Thank you
arranges
very
it.
much. Thank you,
Rivka is
Rivka.
very
Thank
good
you,
at arranging.
Professor Katz.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay, so we are going to wrap it up, and I will share the recording. Please send me an email to herutindia@gmail.com, and Mordecai will upload it on our YouTube channel as well. We have just started a YouTube channel, so we will also upload it there. And I thank you, Professor Katz. It's been an awesome, pleasurable evening. It's so much of data and knowledge, which I didn't know, but I'm very grateful for you spending time with us. And to all our participants, thank you so much. And wishing you a wonderful, wonderful week ahead. And Shawatov, and take care. Shalom. Laila Tov. Thank you.